In the world of rap, not all stories have happy endings. Sometimes the fame and fortune that come with success can be overshadowed by the dangerous lifestyle that many rappers find themselves involved in. This is the story of YBC DUL, a rapper from Philadelphia who rose to fame, but tragically met his downfall too soon. YBC DUL, whose real name was Abdul Vix, grew up in the tough streets of West Philadelphia. The neighborhood he came from was known for its violence, crime, and gang activity. However, for DUL, this was normal. He saw the things happening around him and, like many others, became a part of that world. He was a member of a group called YBC, which stood for Young Bag Chasers. At first, the group was focused on making money and gaining respect in the streets. They wanted to rise above their circumstances and make a name for themselves. DUL quickly became known for his rap skills. He started releasing music that caught people's attention because of how raw and real it was. He wasn't just talking about the tough life in Philadelphia, he was living it. DUL wasn't afraid to name-drop his enemies in his songs, which made him even more infamous. The more popular he got, the bigger the target on his back became. One of the most shocking things DUL did that gained him a lot of attention was a video that went viral. In the video, DUL and his crew dug up the grave of one of their enemies. This act of disrespect shocked people and made DUL even more notorious. His reputation as a fearless and some might say reckless rapper grew. Philadelphia is known to be one of the most violent cities in America, and in 2021, the city reached a record-breaking number of homicides. Among those fueling the violence were groups like YBC, and DUL was one of their most vocal members. His music and actions made him one of the most targeted individuals in the city. It seemed like everyone wanted a piece of him, and he knew it. Despite the dangers, DUL continued to move around the city as if he were untouchable. He claimed that no one had ever robbed him, shot him, or harmed him in any way. He even boasted about it in interviews and on social media, showing no fear. However, in the streets of Philly, no one is truly safe, no matter how powerful they think they are. But how did things get to this point? To understand the full story, we have to go back to the beginning, before the fame, and before the violence escalated. YBC wasn't always involved in deadly conflicts. When the group first started, they were just a bunch of young men trying to survive in a city that seemed to offer them no way out. They wanted to make money, gain respect, and prove that they could be somebody despite their tough upbringing. Their name, Young Bag Chasers, represented their goal of chasing after money and success. They wanted to rise above the poverty and crime that surrounded them. At first, YBC was all about making music and getting noticed. They had talent, and people were starting to take notice of them, both on the streets and in the music industry. However, everything changed in 2019 when one tragic incident sent YBC down a dark path. On May 29th, a teenager named Joshua Davidson was gunned down in broad daylight in the Parkside neighborhood of Philadelphia. The murder shocked the community and hit YBC hard. Joshua was close to many members of the group, and his death changed everything. From that moment on, YBC wasn't just about chasing money anymore. They were out for revenge. The group renamed their neighborhood Josh World in honor of their fallen friend, and they became determined to make those responsible pay. But in the world of gang violence, things are never simple. The people they were after were just a few blocks away, and the conflict quickly escalated. What started as a personal vendetta turned into a full-scale war between YBC and their enemies from 39th Street. This was just the beginning of a series of violent events that would change the course of YBC forever. The streets of West Philadelphia became a battlefield, with DUL and his crew at the center of it all. As their reputation grew, so did the number of people who wanted to see them fall. But for now, DUL remained confident. He was on the rise both in the music world and on the streets. His story was far from over, but little did he know, the dangers he faced were getting closer and closer. As YBC grew in popularity and power, so did their list of enemies. After the tragic death of Joshua Davidson in 2019, YBC declared war on anyone they thought had anything to do with it. This was the beginning of their most dangerous and violent feud yet, with a crew from 39th Street. What started as revenge for a fallen friend turned into a brutal, ongoing battle that claimed more and more lives. The tension between YBC and 39th Street was intense. Both groups were constantly on high alert, always watching their backs, never knowing when the next attack would come. The streets of West Philadelphia became more dangerous than ever. Shootings became a daily occurrence, and innocent people sometimes got caught in the crossfire. It seemed like there was no end in sight. One of the most feared members of 39th Street was a man named Sid, also known as Fro. Sid had a reputation for being a ruthless shooter, and his name was often mentioned in connection with violent incidents across the city. The beef between YBC and Sid's crew escalated when a simple pickup basketball game turned into a deadly confrontation. After the dust settled, a young man named Narek Hawkins was found shot multiple times. This incident only fueled the fire between YBC and 39th Street. DUL and his crew wasted no time in responding. They mentioned Narek's name in their songs, disrespecting him and taunting their rivals. To them, it was all part of the game, but this game was deadly, and every move had serious consequences. Sid, who had already earned a reputation as a killer, became a top target for YBC. They wanted revenge, and they were willing to do whatever it took to get it. The streets were buzzing with talk of who would be next, and both sides prepared for the worst. But in the chaos of this street war, things didn't always go as planned. One night, YBC got word that Sid had been released from jail and was on house arrest. Seeing this as their chance, they decided to ambush him as soon as he stepped outside. But in the heat of the moment, they made a terrible mistake. They shot and killed the wrong person, an innocent 20-year-old man who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. This mistake made things even worse. The streets were now in a frenzy, and the violence only escalated. No one was safe. Even young children became victims of this deadly war. In one heartbreaking incident, a 6-year-old child was hit during a drive-by shooting. This shooting made national news, putting even more pressure on both sides. Despite the chaos, Sid continued to move carefully, trying to avoid the relentless attacks from YBC. His family tried to help him lay low, even moving him out of the city for a while. But as anyone involved in street life knows, you can't run forever. Eventually, Sid returned to Philadelphia, and YBC was waiting for him. In September 2021, Sid was at home with his father when two masked men showed up at their door. They fired through the screen door, hitting both Sid and his father. Sid didn't survive the attack, and his father was left critically injured. YBC had finally taken out one of their biggest enemies, but the cost had been high. The streets were more dangerous than ever, and the police were beginning to crack down on everyone involved. The police had been following the violence closely, and they weren't going to let YBC get away with this one. They quickly swarmed the scene, and in the chaos that followed, one of YBC's top shooters, a man known as Curry, was arrested. Curry had a reputation for being a deadly gunman, and his arrest was a significant blow to YBC. But this wasn't the end of the war. In fact, it was just the beginning of a new chapter. As news of Sid's death spread, other gangs in the area decided to join forces against YBC. This included groups like 39th Street and 56th Street, who saw YBC as a common enemy. They were determined to take them down, no matter what it took. For YBC, the pressure was building. Their enemies were growing stronger, and the police were closing in. DUL and his crew had started a war that they couldn't control, and now they were paying the price. The streets of West Philadelphia had become a war zone, and there was no telling who would survive the next battle. The conflict that had started with one tragic death had now spiraled into something much bigger and much deadlier. As the war between YBC and their rivals grew fiercer, the entire city of Philadelphia seemed to get involved. What started as a beef between two groups had now spread like wildfire. Gangs from different neighborhoods, who may not have been friendly with each other before, started to join forces with one goal in mind: take down YBC. It was as if YBC had a target on their back, and everyone wanted to be the one to take the shot. One of the first groups to join the fight was a ruthless gang known as OT the Four. They were tight with 39th Street, and after seeing YBC members diss one of their own, they were ready for revenge. Lil Mir, a rising rapper from North Philly and a member of OT the Four, was killed in a shooting. Not long after, YBC members were dissing Lil Mir in their songs, mocking his death in a way that shocked even the toughest of gang members. This disrespect sparked a fire that couldn't be put out. The deaths of KJ and Tommy were devastating, not just to their families but to the entire community. They were two more young lives lost to the violence that seemed to be consuming Philadelphia. Their deaths brought even more gangs into the fight against YBC. The Clappers, along with other gangs like 56th Street, made it their mission to take down YBC once and for all. At this point, it seemed like there was no way out for YBC. They had made too many enemies, and now those enemies were coming together to destroy them. But YBC wasn't going down without a fight. Despite the overwhelming odds against them, they continued to retaliate, trying to keep their grip on the streets of West Philly. However, with each attack, they were digging themselves deeper into a hole that they couldn't escape from. The year 2021 was one of the bloodiest years in Philadelphia's history, and YBC was at the center of it all. Every day brought new headlines of shootings, murders, and arrests. The police were overwhelmed, the community was living in fear, and the gangs were at war. It wasn't just about YBC and 39th Street anymore. The conflict had grown beyond just a few groups. It was now a citywide battle that involved some of the most dangerous gangs in Philadelphia. For YBC, the walls were closing in, and it was only a matter of time before their reign of terror would come to an end. But as the violence continued to escalate, it became clear that this war wasn't just going to end with one final battle. The damage had been done, and the city of Philadelphia would be dealing with the consequences for a long time to come. By 2021, the pressure on YBC was unbearable. The once powerful gang that had terrorized West Philadelphia was now fighting for survival. Their enemies had formed alliances against them, and the police were cracking down harder than ever. The streets that YBC had once ruled were now filled with danger at every corner. It seemed like there was no safe place for them anymore. One of the first major blows to YBC was the death of J100, one of the founding members of the group. J100 had been there since the beginning, back when YBC was just a group of young men trying to make money and gain respect. He was a leader, and his death hit the group hard. Without him, YBC began to crumble from the inside. The unity they once had was falling apart, and it seemed like their days were numbered. But that wasn't the only loss they faced. YBC DUL, the face of the group, also suffered a devastating blow when his cousin, Dufetti, was shot and killed in broad daylight. Dufetti had been like a brother to DUL, and his death was a harsh reminder that no one was safe. The streets didn't care about your status, your connections, or your fame. Anyone could be next. At the same time, the police were making it clear that they had had enough of the violence. Philadelphia District Attorney Larry Krasner publicly stated that YBC was at the top of his list of gangs to take down. The police began launching major investigations, arresting members, and putting pressure on the gang from all sides. It was clear that the law was closing in, and YBC had fewer places to hide. The streets were also turning on YBC. The war with their rivals had left a trail of blood and destruction that affected everyone, even those who weren't directly involved. Families in the neighborhood were tired of living in fear, tired of the violence, and tired of seeing their loved ones become victims. YBC had once been feared and respected, but now they were seen as a problem that needed to be solved. Despite all of this, YBC DUL seemed to be one of the few members who understood that things were getting out of hand. For a while, it looked like he might have been ready to leave the street life behind. He moved to Los Angeles for a period of time and even did interviews with popular platforms like No Jumper. It seemed like DUL was focusing on his rap career, trying to escape the violence in Philly. But no matter how far he went, the streets of Philadelphia followed him. DUL continued to make headlines, not just for his music, but for his actions. In February 2024, he made a video that would go viral for all the wrong reasons. In the video, DUL was seen digging up the grave of one of his enemies and disrespecting it in front of the camera. It was shocking, even by the standards of Philly's street scene, and many people saw it as a sign that DUL wasn't truly ready to leave the streets behind. For some, it seemed like DUL was tempting fate. Disrespecting the dead is one of the most extreme things you can do in gang culture, and it almost always brings retaliation. People who had done similar things before had met tragic ends, and many believed that it was only a matter of time before the same thing happened to DUL. Even though he had spent time away from Philly, DUL eventually returned to his hometown. On August 23, 2024, just 24 hours after a popular YouTuber named Brandon Buckingham had filmed a vlog with DUL in his neighborhood, tragedy struck. DUL was shot multiple times while getting into his car, a white Lexus, in broad daylight. He was rushed to the hospital by his friends, but it was too late. YBC DUL, the infamous rapper who had become one of Philly's most feared figures, was pronounced dead. The news of his death spread quickly, and it marked the end of an era for YBC. DUL's death wasn't just the end of a single life. It was the final blow to a gang that had once seemed unstoppable. With DUL gone, YBC had lost its most well-known member, and the remaining members were either dead, in prison, or on the run. The violence that had defined the pandemic era of Philadelphia's gang wars had taken yet another life, but it was clear that this wasn't just about one man or one gang. The city had been caught in a cycle of violence that affected everyone, and DUL's death was just another chapter in a story that wasn't over yet. As the news of DUL's death made headlines, many people were left to reflect on the lives lost in this ongoing war. Some saw DUL as a tragic figure who couldn't escape the streets, while others saw him as just another gangster who got what was coming to him. But no matter how people felt about him, one thing was certain. YBC DUL had left a mark on Philadelphia, and his story would be remembered for years to come. The end of YBC was a reminder that street life, no matter how glamorous it might seem in music or on social media, always comes with a price. DUL had risen from nothing, become a feared figure in the city, and even made a name for himself in the rap game. But in the end, he couldn't escape the streets that had shaped him. With DUL's death, YBC's reign over West Philadelphia was finally over. But the violence they had helped create would continue to haunt the city, leaving families to pick up the pieces and wonder when it would all come to an end. YBC DUL's death marked the end of one of Philadelphia's most infamous gangs. But the aftermath of his passing left an entire community grappling with the cycle of violence that had plagued it for so long. For the people who lived in the neighborhoods where YBC once ruled, life did not suddenly get better. The violence didn't just disappear because YBC DUL was gone. The wounds left behind by years of gang warfare were deep, and healing was going to take a long time. In the days following DUL's death, the streets of Philadelphia were filled with mixed emotions. Some people mourned the loss of a talented rapper who had been on the verge of making it big. They saw DUL as someone who could have used his fame to change his life, but who had been pulled back into the dangerous world he came from. Others, however, saw his death as the inevitable outcome of the path he had chosen. To them, DUL wasn't a hero. He was another victim of the same violence that he had helped create. The city of Philadelphia had been dealing with high levels of violence for years, and YBC DUL's death was just one more tragedy in a long list. The police continued to investigate the shootings, but they knew that simply arresting people wouldn't stop the violence. The problems that had led to the rise of gangs like YBC were much bigger than just one group or one person. For many people in the community, the focus shifted to finding ways to prevent the next generation from following in the footsteps of YBC and other gangs. Community leaders, activists, and even former gang members began working together to find solutions to the cycle of violence. They knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but they were determined to do whatever they could to stop the violence from continuing. One of the biggest challenges facing the community was addressing the root causes of the violence. Poverty, lack of education, and limited opportunities for young people were all factors that contributed to the rise of gangs like YBC. Without addressing these issues, it would be difficult to prevent other groups from forming and continuing the cycle of violence. There were also efforts to reach out to the young people who were already involved in gang life. Mentorship programs, job training, and counseling were some of the ways that community organizations tried to help those who were caught up in the streets. They wanted to show them that there were other options, that they didn't have to live and die by the gun. But for many, the pain of losing friends, family members, and neighbors to the violence was still fresh. The scars left behind by years of gang warfare were not just physical, they were emotional and psychological as well. Entire neighborhoods had been traumatized by the violence, and the process of healing was slow and difficult. YBC DUL's legacy was complicated. He had risen from the streets of West Philadelphia to become a feared and respected figure in the city's gang scene. He was known for his music and for his willingness to confront his enemies head-on. But his story was also a cautionary tale about the dangers of street life. DUL had tried to leave the streets behind, but in the end, they pulled him back in.